right, well, let's get started. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Jeremy Rogers, the Director of Legal Affairs and Public Policy for the Oregon Association of Realtors. And today we're going to be talking about remote online notarization, or RON as we call it. So this webinar is being presented concurrently in Zoom and in YouTube. If you're in Zoom, use the chat function and send to all presenters. Make sure it's going to all presenters with your questions. In YouTube, also use the chat function and your questions will be shared with the presenters. If you need any help at any point during this webinar, if you're having technology issues, you can email education@oregonrealtors.org and you can call 503-362-3645 or the toll-free number that you see there, 800-252-9115. Now, if you registered for the webinar, which you should have done, your CE credit is being processed, so don't worry about that. That's happening. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will jump into the discussion. So today we have with us a very distinguished panel. Ruth Miles has 18 years of experience running small businesses and served for 9 years as chief of staff and other positions in the legislative branch of government. And she has particular understanding of the challenges that entrepreneurs face through her work. In fact, following her service in the legislature, she served as the inaugural small business advocate for the Oregon Secretary of State's office. And then she stepped in service as the director of the corporations division for the Oregon Secretary of State's office. In this role, she oversees the legacy systems of the corporations division, including the business registry, uniform commercial code, notary commissioning and regulation, as well as overseeing the small business advocacy office. Ruth has served also as the inaugural tribal liaison for the Oregon Secretary of State since 2018. And in this capacity, she oversees agency relations with 9 federally recognized tribes with political headquarters within Oregon. And she works to continuously improve communication between the Secretary of State and tribal sovereign governments. Ruth completed her professional certification in tribal relations through Portland State University in August of 2019. Jamie Weddle is the Training, Compliance, and Operation Officer for the Corporations Division of the Oregon Secretary of State's office. She is responsible for training all staff as well as ensuring compliance in all areas of the division. She also provides assistance to attorneys and service companies in regards to compliance. She's worked with the division for 10 years and is a subject matter expert for the business registry, notary, and uniform commercial code programs. She's worked with the Oregon Law Commission as part of the work group that crafted the legislation for remote online notarization, and she assisted in creating the temporary rules, training, forms, and website content for the implementation of the RON program. Rich Bailey is Regional Underwriting Counsel for First American Title Insurance Company and is located in Portland, Oregon. Rich has over 19 years of experience in the real estate industry. Before joining First American in 2015, Rich spent over 15 years as a real estate and lending attorney at various law firms in Oregon and Michigan, most recently as a shareholder at Schwab, Williamson & Wyatt in Portland, and 2 years as general counsel for a small real estate development company in Michigan. In addition to a law degree from Lewis and Clark College, Rich has a Master's of Business Administration degree from The Ohio State University and a Bachelor's of Business Administration degree from Eastern Michigan University. He also worked in the business world for 5 years before attending law school in the areas of corporate accounting and sales. So that is our panel, a very distinguished panel and very appropriate panel to talk to us about remote online notarization. So I want to kick it off first with a question, and then we'll move to a presentation from Ruth and Jamie. But first question I have is, up until recently, Oregon did not allow remote online notarization, and we, of course, are in the middle of a pandemic that surprised all of us. So I just want to hear from you all about what has in-person notarization looked like during the age of the pandemic. What have people tried to do to be able to social distance and stay safe and healthy, and if and how has it impacted the market at all in terms of notaries wanting to perform services for safety reasons, as well as customers and clients wanting to pursue their transactions?
Well, how about I start out by talking about the escrow industry itself? The escrow industry has been pretty creative. Obviously, it was a lot of chaos at the beginning back in March when, the virus outbreak first kind of, hit a critical mass and up in the Seattle area. And, our company was worried about the customers, but also our employees, because we didn't want our employees to get sick either. And so we almost immediately went to almost all remote notarization. And that's where you have not remote. I'm using the wrong terminology, but a mobile notary. We went to mobile notaries almost instantaneously for a lot of our areas in the state. And that's where you have a notary that actually drive out to the customer's house and do the signing. And that way we were able to protect our own employees and then only expose the customers to one person. And, if there was an issue with maybe somebody in the house potentially having the virus, or if they're really, really concerned, that notary, instead of going into their house, could, was signing on the back deck or the front porch or something along those lines, so they could be out in the open air. We also had a few of our offices do drive-up notarizations where the customers would sign all the documents they could sign electronically before their signing appointment, and then drive up to our office, and then we'd have a notary come out and notarize documents through the window of a car. And so that was kind of creative. And then over time our offices kind of opened up when we had protocols to allow people to come into the offices, but they would have to, it was limited to only people that were doing the signing, no family members, no kids, things like that. And then they had to sanitize their hands. There was a glass screen, where the signer was on one side and the parties were on the other side. And so we implemented those protocols over time. But it was definitely a big adjustment, and added, the mobile notaries, cost more than just a regular, in-office notary. Generally, our company was eating those costs because we were requiring that rather than allowing people to come into the office. And so that's kind of one thing. It would have been an increased cost, but we decided to eat those costs to protect our employees.
Great. Thanks, Rich. Ruth and Jamie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, for sure. We saw a lot of creative solutions to the problem of a safe traditional notarization. And some of those solutions, I've just got to be frank with you, were not legal. We heard from customers who were saying, look, the notary came up, dropped the package on my porch. I took it inside. I signed it out of sight of the notary. I brought it back out. They stamped it and we were good to go. But that's not legal notarization. And so we saw a lot of those kinds of things, and we started to have real concerns about whether or not there was clarity around personal appearance before the notary, what that actually requires. So we did send out guidance to notaries on just some practical things to do, wearing gloves, giving the client a pen if they didn't have their own and not taking it back, sanitizing before and after. We heard about notaries traveling with a card table that they would sanitize before and after, just in the presence of that client, so that they were clear that it was as clean as it could possibly be. But yeah, for mobile notaries, we were seeing a lot of really creative solutions, some of which worked and some which didn't.
Well, I think, Jamie, anything you want to add before we go to the presentation?
No, I think they covered it very well.
Great. Well, this is a good segue to the presentation. So Ruth, if you want to take over and sort of tell us, and you can tell us about what is remote notarization, how does it compare to other types of notarization in Oregon, and sort of what are the details of all this?
Okay. Can you confirm that you see the screen?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with all of you today. And I want to stress, I'm going to give contact information throughout the presentation. I really wanted to make sure that you understand we want to have an open channel of communication so that we can answer any questions that you have. Again, I'm Ruth Miles, a Corporation Division Director and Tribal Liaison. And Jamie, we've already been introduced, so I'm going to kind of skip over this. But I will say this presentation has our direct contact information. You have access to it now and then after the webinar. And so we just want to make sure that you're aware. You're welcome and encouraged to contact us with specific questions, especially if you're encountering sort of systemic issues. So our goals today are to discuss kind of traditional and electronic notarization, which have been legal in Oregon for a while, let you know kind of what's required of notaries and consumers, and what sorts of notary transactions are in Oregon, because the states do differ a bit on this. We want to make sure that this lays the groundwork for you so that we can then demystify the whole process around remote online notarization. And we'll discuss how it differs from these other methods. We'll definitely give you some tips on how to prepare yourself and your clients. And I know Rich is also going to do that as well. And then we want to make sure, again, that you know who to contact if a problem arises. So Jamie, can you talk about notary laws and regulations?
Definitely. I wanted to take a few minutes to go through some of what we've had in the past, what we still have, but traditional and IPEN, which is also known as in-person electronic notarization. Traditional notarizations require the signer to appear in the physical presence of the notary. So that's what we've been dealing with all this time and what we were having problems with because of the pandemic. Electronic or IPEN notarization is also legal in Oregon. In electronic notarization, it still requires the signer to be in the presence of the notary, but everything is done digitally, including the signing and stamping is done that way as well. Notaries must be 18 years of age or older, and a notary commission is for 4 years. Commissions are not automatically renewed, so once the commission is ready to expire, then the notary has to go and reapply to get their commission renewed. Notaries who are not attorneys or under the supervision of an attorney, like a paralegal, cannot prepare legal documents. So one of the things that a lot of times I hear is people will say, oh, I need to go to a notary because I have to complete this paperwork for court. And the notary is not the person who gives the advice on how to complete those documents. All the notary is there for is to basically make sure that the person is who they say they are and confirm that with identification and have them sign in front of them. So it's one of those fine lines that notaries have to make sure that they are not giving legal advice. And notaries or their spouses cannot be a party to or have beneficial interest in the notarization. We get that question a lot as well, is can I notarize something for my spouse? And no, you cannot. So that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we're clear on. Notaries can refuse to notarize a document if they feel there's some fraudulent aspect to it. One of the things that we always make sure we want to say is if you do refuse to notarize, make sure that you document that in your journal. So that way you have the documentation of why you refused. And notaries cannot notarize blank or incomplete documents. So they do need to make sure that the document is completed and doesn't have any blank spaces. Notaries must always use a stamp. So physical or digital. They can also use an embosser, but the stamp is always required. So as far as paper traditional notarization, a lot of times they'll want to use an embosser too, and they can, but the stamp always has to be there. Notary fees must be disclosed before the notarization takes place. And so one of the other parts of that is those notaries that travel can charge an additional fee for their travel charges. Notaries must complete a training course. They have to pass our exam and take an oath of office in order to obtain a commission. And notaries who commit intentional misconduct are subject to administrative, civil, or criminal penalties. So we do regulate, we do investigate, and we do enforce that they're following all the proper guidelines. And notaries cannot use the term notario publico. That is a term that's very much saying that they're an attorney, and we don't want to use that term. There are different types of transactions, and you probably know about these already if you've already been notarizing. There's acknowledgement in the individual capacity, acknowledgement in a representative capacity, and verification upon oath or affirmation. And those three are probably the ones that we see happen the most. Witnessing or attesting a signature is another one that we see a lot of. And then there's certifying to a copy of a document. And that one is where the notary makes the copy and notarizes that the copy is in the possession of whoever is needing the notarization done. And then acknowledgement of an individual capacity, that was on the page before. But I believe that these slides are given out to everyone, so you'll probably want to take a few minutes to read through them and see what they each are if you haven't had the opportunity to do any of those.
Thanks, Jamie. So you wanted to hear about remote online notarization, and so now we're going to talk about that specifically. So first thing to know is that a notary has to be already commissioned with the state of Oregon as a notary and be in good standing before they can even start this process. And so in order to get certified to include raw notarizations as part of their practice, they must watch our training video, which is, we just have it up on YouTube. So it's super simple to go and do, and you can watch it if you want. They've got to find and enroll with a vendor that meets the technology requirements of our regulation that I've specified here. And I just want to be clear, remote online notarization is conducted using a cloud-based platform. There are several that are commercially available in the US, and the vast majority of them meet our requirements. Our requirements in Oregon are in alignment with the requirements in other states that have adopted permanent remote online notarization. And because of that, if a platform warrants to a notary that they actually meet our requirements, they do. So they've got to get that enrolled process done. And the process of that also includes the platform generating a digital stamp and signature for that notary. They complete our form, our remote online notarization notice form, and they send it in to us with a copy of that digital stamp and signature. And then they wait. They still can't perform remote online notarizations. And then when they get an acknowledgement from us, that is when they're able to do those remote online notarizations and not before. And they go into a database so that we know that they're able to do this particular kind of notarization in addition to traditional notarizations. So
Ruth?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask you just a quick question on that last slide, because I was putting together guidance for our company, and you know, and one thing I was curious about is, does a notary also have to be registered as an electronic notary in Oregon? And then is that a requirement in order to be a RON as well?
No, so that's a great question. A notary who is commissioned in the state of Oregon just to do traditional notarizations can become a RON notary. And then those notaries who also have that certification or sort of endorsement to do IPEN or in-person electronic notarization can also do it. But you don't have to do, it's not a graduated step process, except that you've got to do traditional first. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
So here are some elements that are required for raw notarizations, and the platforms that notaries enroll with have to meet these particular requirements, and they all have to be included in the same platform. So first thing is credential analysis, and there's an industry term, knowledge-based authentication, or KBA is sort of the industry term for what this is, but it's essentially a multi-factor authentication process. So when your client starts the process of a raw notarization, they're interacting first with the platform and answering some questions. I know Rich is going to talk a little bit about what this takes to start in his presentation, so I won't go too deep into it, other than to say that you'd be answering questions about your identity. And then that process of knowledge-based authentication, it concludes with the notary seeing the copy of your identity or your ID on their screen and comparing it with you and making sure that you answered the questions that were part of the other pieces of knowledge-based authentication properly. So this is all designed to prevent fraud. So it does include ID capture, but it's digitally safe to do. Second thing, the notary has to have a digital journal that's part of the platform. They can also keep a paper copy of what raw notarizations they're doing, but that's their prerogative. It's not a requirement. The platform has to have privacy and data security for both the notary and signer. And I might add that privacy and data security does not mean that a regulator can't look at it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's got to have recorded, reliable, synchronous audio and video with the kind of clarity so that everybody can understand each other. If we'll get into what are problems with RON, and if there's a connection problem, that means that the signer and the notary can't clearly hear and understand each other, then it's got to be stopped. And the platform has to offer an option to do that. So the transaction documents that are executed during the run are not part of the recording. So I just want to be clear about that, just for client safety, security, and for their own privacy as well. But the type of document would be a piece of it. Secure document upload and transfer between the signer and notary are part of this, as are digital signing and stamping. And that digital signature and stamp are set up, as I mentioned before, when the notary is enrolling with the platform. So we've talked about kind of the elements of what RON is. So let's talk about what it's not, because we've been hearing some horror stories, and I want to make sure that you or your clients don't end up being part of one of those horror stories. So notaries cannot legally perform a remote online notarization using FaceTime or Zoom or GoToMeeting or Teams or whatever the Google thing is now, Google Meet, I guess. Or other sort of popularly available video conferencing applications. These do not have all of the technological specifications that are required for a RON platform. If the notary can't verify the identity of the signer, they can't move forward. And this is true with traditional notarizations as well. It's nothing new. If the signer is unaware of the purpose for the notarization, then the notary can't move forward. And this is, again, something that is a carryover from traditional notarization. If the notary believes that the signer has been coerced into asking for the notarization, they can't move forward, because again, this is an indication of fraud or potential fraud. If the audio and video quality is such that they can't understand and see each other, then they've both got to stop. If the notary allows documents to be signed out of the site of the notary, then this is not a valid RON notarization, and the client should stop it immediately. If the RON platform doesn't contain all of the elements that we already talked about that are in its OAR 160, 100, Division 800 and 850. So if it doesn't contain all of those elements, then it's sort of buyer beware. You don't want to participate in that. Signers should not participate in a remote online notarization that doesn't contain all of those elements we already talked about. If they can't understand the notary, or if they're asked or allowed to sign documents out of sight of the notary. So these are like some common sense things that mostly are carryovers from traditional notarization, but they're showstoppers when it comes to RON notarization. So it's important that your clients know what to expect, or you, frankly, if you're going to participate in a RON notarization. And I know Rich is going to talk about what it looks like in real life, but Jamie and I wanted to pass along some basic things to remember. So I'd suggest familiarizing yourself with the principles of remote online notarization. We have a remote online notarization for consumers video online. There's this complicated long link that's in the presentation, but you can also go to the corporation division, Oregon Corporation Division YouTube channel and look for RON for consumers. It's a quick little video that kind of goes over some of those elements that we've talked about here so that consumers know what to look for, and it's helpful for you as a realtor. Make sure that you understand that notaries from other states may be the ones that perform the RON notarization. This is a new part of the legislation that was passed in Oregon. So before now, if you got something notarized in another state and you brought it to Oregon, well, then it was perfectly valid. But if you were an Oregon, or if you were an Oregon signer and you needed to do a high value closing, like a real estate transaction, you couldn't have a notary come from, say, Washington, who was not commissioned in Oregon to do the traditional notarization or the IPEN notarization for you. That's a difference with the RON platform, where a consumer may log on and it may be a notary from, say, Florida or Virginia who performs the notarization. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that is, but in a few minutes. But I do want to make sure that you understand that as long as the notary is in good standing with their state in terms of their commission and they've been enrolled by the platform, then this is now legal and the notarization would be valid unless there is some other concern. So just make sure that your clients know that a notary from another state may be doing the notarization. High value notarizations, whether they're traditional, IPEN, or RON, can cause some stress for the notary and for the client. And you all know this. I mean, there's a lot of money at stake. You want to make sure it all goes smoothly and that your client is prepared. So I would just make sure that you're working with the title company and the lender and the client to make sure that they're prepared for how long it will take to finish the notarization, that they will have to sign multiple documents, and that they understand the reasons for the documents, that they've done their due diligence by reading through what they're going to sign ahead of time. And then want to make sure that you let your clients know that the fee for RON notarizations is higher. So notarizations that are traditional or IPEN are $10 per notarization, unless there are travel fees associated with it. And then that adds to the fee, and that's negotiated ahead of time before the notarization takes place. But for RON notarizations, it's $25 per notarization. And so that's an important consideration. And then if you know how those notarization fees are going to be reflected in closing costs, you might want to also talk with your client about that so they know what to expect. And then if you or your clients have kind of routine questions or concerns, contact corporation.division@oregon.gov with those questions. So here's the reason why a notary from another state may perform the notarization. You can see at the bottom bar, we've got almost 40,000 commissioned notaries in the state of Oregon, and this is as of June 30th. So it may be slightly different right now. We only have, of those, 25 people who are commissioned to do IPEN or in-person electronic notarization. And then we have 54 as of June 30th who are now certified to do RON notarizations. So when you compare 54 with 40,000, it's a big difference in numbers. And so that's the reason why you might see a notary from another state doing a notarization. This is a chart that Jamie put together that is just a beautiful, simple, and easy to read side-by-side comparison of different types of notarization, with traditional notarizations in blue, in-person electronic notarization in that sort of, I guess, orange color, and then in green, remote online notarization. We have this chart on our website. Jamie sent a copy of it to Erica, and she can get that to you if you want it. And you'll see it probably continued to be on our website because it's such a helpful way for people to understand the differences between these different types of notarizations. It's helpful for consumers and it's helpful for notaries. So I want to be clear with you that this is a huge change for Oregon. And while we worked really hard to develop legislation that legislators could adopt for permanent adoption of remote online notarization, the pandemic really gave them an opportunity to do a pilot program before they commit to permanent adoption. And so we're rolling this out as if it is permanent. The legislation lasts through June 30th. We think that they're going to consider permanent adoption well before June 30th, 2021. And so there shouldn't be any break in service, I would guess. I guess that's the best way to say it. But there are some challenges that I want to pass along to you. This surprises me, but notaries are having difficulty completing our form. And so we're making some adjustments to the form just to make sure that they understand what they do. So there's a page of instructions, and then we have just implemented a new opt-in situation. So when we have a preponderance of notaries that opt in, we're going to publish information that they have allowed us to publish in addition to their name and commission number and city. So that if a client is trying to reach them to get a raw notarization done, that might be one way that they do it. So that's not up yet, but hopefully soon. We have gotten a couple of applications from notaries with their stamp and digital signature that don't look like they came from a platform. And this is of real concern to us. In fact, we know of at least one notary who was concerned about the prices associated with enrolling with the platform, didn't want to do it until she got permission to actually do the raw notarizations, but we require it to be the other way around. And so in that case, we had to reject that application. And so they had to go actually enroll with the platform. So we're checking with the platforms to make sure that the notaries are actually enrolled. We heard from a customer that a couple of concerns happened with RON platforms. One platform failed to show up for an appointment, a notarization that was a fixed time. They just didn't show up. And so the notarization wasn't done using that platform. So we're reevaluating whether or not they appear on our list. We're going to have to see, they still meet our criteria to be on the list, except that if they continue to demonstrate customer service problems like this, then we're going to have to take them off. In addition, another platform was unable to see an Oregon state issued identification. And so that's a problem. As you know, Oregon is transitioning from our previous IDs and driver's licenses to real ID compliant IDs. And that may have been a factor in this case, but we're not clear about that. So we're going to keep watching this platform and see what happens with it. And then for Oregon Commission notaries that want to do RONs, we don't have enough who want to do that. But I'll be honest with you, we're not going to push notaries to do this. We'd like them to consider it, but we really only want truly experienced notaries who are confident in their practice, understand what the law says to do remote online notarizations, because the potential for fraud is there if they don't have that level of experience.
Hey, Ruth.
Yes.
Just real quick, I might be able to enlighten you on kind of the title industry's perspective on that last point that you made. And, about few notaries wanting to do RON notarizations. And our company, First American, and we're like one of the biggest in the market. Our people are so busy right now that we don't want them to spend their time getting certified for RON notarization. Plus the backlog on the platforms to get certified,
Right.
is a couple of months. And because we're allowed to use, out-of-state notarizations, we're just taking advantage of people who have already been certified in other states and are on the platforms. And that's just due to the fact that our volume is so huge right now with refis and resales that, we're actually busier than we were last year. And I think the other title companies are in the same position.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Comments?
Ruth, we did get a question in the chat box, and you may or may not be able to answer it though. Around someone wanted to know which platforms on the watch list, but I'm not sure if that's something you can disclose or not.
No, I'm not going to disclose it right now. If we start to see a problem with these platforms, the thing I guess that I would emphasize is that every platform that's on our list online for notaries meets our criteria for technological specifications. But it concerns me if a platform commits to doing a notarization at a fixed time, doesn't show up, or if the system isn't able to see our IDs. But again, these are isolated circumstances, so I'm not ready to take them off the list yet. We need to see what happens with that because they still meet our technological specifications. But good question.
Ruth, I have a question, and it just reflects my ignorance of the subject. But it's interesting to hear you talk about the platforms showing up. So it's like a real-time thing, a very unlike Zoom, where it's always there if you want to use it, right? So can you just help us understand what that means for a platform to show up versus just being there?
So the platform is always there, but whether or not there's been an arrangement for a notarization to happen at a particular time or to happen, so there, and Rich, you can fill in the blanks here, because I've not participated in a raw notarization. I got to be clear about that. I've studied it. I've been steeping in it for about a year, but that doesn't take the place of actually doing it. So if somebody needs, like, say, just a garden variety notarization, not a high value transaction like this, where you're going to plan out who's going to do the notarization, it's going to be a multiple documents to sign, really quite a sheaf of paperwork that's very important to get right. But if you have, say, a letter for your insurance company that, or a certificate or something that needs to be notarized, then you can log on to a RON platform as an Oregonian right now. And I'll give you an example. I know notarize.com has notaries that come from all kinds of states. And if a notary is available, then they'll pull your notarization request. They'll review the knowledge-based authentication, and then you go through the notarization with them, and you log on when it's convenient for you. And then you can also do, with some platforms, a fixed time notarization where you've made an appointment with a notary. And it depends on the terms of how the notary is enrolled with the platform and what their limitations are on notaries. So some notaries or some platforms only have employees or contractors who are performing notarizations. They're not just open to any notary. Some of them are only open to business partners. So like First American, for instance, they're going to look for those bigger customers that have, hundreds or thousands of notaries in their organization, and they're going to work with them only. And so then that gives them an ability to do notarizations in a different way. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So I guess the appointment that you make is with the platform, not with a particular notary, and then the platform.
No, it's with the notary.
Yeah.
But not every platform allows that. So yeah, if you have questions, though, if you have concerns about this, about what to expect, or if you've had a problem, please let us know. This is the general contact information for the corporation division. And I see I made an error in the URL. I can't believe that. I type this all the time. So it's sos.oregon.gov/business. So sos.oregon.gov/business. And I'll try and put that in the chat window when I'm no longer sharing my screen. And then, of course, you can email or call us, corporation.division@oregon.gov. Really quick way to reach us and let us know what's going on. So we talked about laws, regulations around traditional and electronic notarization to sort of set the stage. Now what is required of notaries and customers and lots of the types of notary transactions. How remote online notarization differs from traditional and electronic notarization. And you've got at least a better idea of how to prepare yourself and your customers for raw notarizations. And then who to contact when problems arise. But I'm going to add my contact information and Jamie's again. And again, this is our direct contact information. It's in here twice because I want you to know that we serve you. And if you're having problems, if you have ideas about implementation, if you have concerns or problems, or if you need to make a complaint, Jamie or I would be happy to help you with that. And that's all I've got.
Great. Thank you so much. Rich, do you want to take over and give us your perspective on this?
Yeah, let me share my screen here. Let's see.
And Erica, I can see the questions in the Zoom, but I'm not seeing the ones from YouTube. So if there's any questions coming in on YouTube, just jump in with those.
Thank you. Yeah, so far no YouTube questions.
So Jeremy, can you guys see my slide?
Yeah, we can.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. All right, so my part of the presentation isn't going to be super long, but I'm going to talk about kind of some of the potential issues with Ron in general. And when I talk about this, just keep in the back of your mind that, you know, the things that title companies are concerned about and the things, you know, that lenders are concerned about, you know, pretty much align, at least with respect to the first point, and that's fraud prevention. You can imagine that with remote online notarization, you know, there is a potential for fraud depending on, you know, the laws that govern that remote online notarization. And not every state, you know, has the laws that Oregon has. Some of the states are much looser. Some of the states allow Zoom notarization that isn't allowed in Oregon, et cetera. And so from a title insurance companies and a lender's perspective, you know, we really need to watch out for fraud. I mean, how do we know that the person on the other side of the video chat is the actual person? I mean, if they're going to show us an ID, how do we know that ID is not fake, right? How do we know we're not looking at a fake ID? You know, so, you know, proving the identity of somebody that's not there physically in front of you is really, really critical for title companies and lenders. You know, we need to make sure that we're comfortable with that. And in some cases, we're not. And that's what I'm going to kind of talk about here. And the other aspect of the remote online notarization is, you know, there's a legal defenses to, you know, document validity, like called duress. How do you know that somebody's not holding a gun to the person on the screen, you know, just outside of where the screen is viewed, saying, you know, sign this document or I'm gonna shoot you. You don't really know that when somebody's not physically present. And so those are just some of the concerns to keep in the back of your mind when I go through the next couple of points. Hopefully my screen changed. And so I want to first talk about, you know, why like certain lenders don't accept RON documents yet. I think ultimately in the United States, you know, we'll get to the point where, you know, most lenders, you know, are going to allow for all electronic closings. I mean, that's the dream, where people don't have to come physically into an office and all the documents can be signed and notarized electronically. I mean, that's just not the case today. And, you know, there are many lenders, many major lenders now that will not accept remote online notarized loan documents. And part of that is because of the Uniform Commercial Code. And I'm not going to get into great detail on this, but a promissory note is a negotiable instrument. And in order for a lender to perfect a security interest in that promissory note, they have to possess the original note. Well, if you have an electronically signed promissory note, and you guys know you can just hit copy, right? I'm going to copy this document. And all of a sudden now you got 4 notes that are identical. You know, if you look at the electronic document, well, which one's the original? And so how can a lender take possession of original when there's 6 copies floating around? And so that's one of the biggest issues, you know, with lenders nowadays, is that, you know, they can't perfect their security interest in that promissory note. Now, there is a process for that. And what happens is a lender has to be set up to take e-notes, and then those e-notes have to be saved in an e-vault. And I'm not going to get into any of the details about what all that means. Just know that it's a complicated process. You know, it costs money, and not all lenders are set up for that. Matter of fact, a lot of them aren't nowadays, a lot of the major ones. So, you know, even if you know, RON is allowed, let's say in Oregon, and a title company is willing to accept the RON document, you could easily find out that your lender or that your client's lender is not going to accept it. And so one of the first things you got to do is you got to talk to the lender about whether they're going to accept RON documents or not. And again, so, you know, one issue is with the e-notes, even when you have hybrid closing. So in hybrid closing is where, you know, you'll have all the loan documents signed electronically, and maybe even the deed of trust remotely notarized, as long as it's acceptable to the title company. But you'll have the promissory note, a wedding signature on the promissory note that gets changed back. You know, some lenders, when you have a hybrid, when somebody's asking for a hybrid closing where you can get over the fact that the promissory note is going to have a wedding signature, they're still not comfortable with it yet. And so I would honestly say, just based on my experience during this pandemic, that you'll find that most major lenders, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, aren't accepting RON nowadays. So be aware of that. It's a real legitimate issue. The other part of this is that, you know, notwithstanding the fact that the laws are in place, title insurance companies, not all of them are going to accept, you know, RON documents. And you may ask, well, why does it matter what the title insurance companies are going to accept? It's because, you know, the buyers of properties and the lenders are getting title insurance policies, and they're relying on those title insurance policies, you know, in order to give the loan, or a buyer in terms of buying the property and making sure they have good title. And so if a title insurance company is not willing to issue a policy based on, let's say, insuring a RON deed or a RON deed of trust, well, that lender, you know, is not going to get their title insurance policy, so the closing's not going to happen. So title insurance have, you know, a big bearing on whether RON's accepted or not. And again, they'll only accept RON documents if, you know, for example, the platform itself is credible. And I'll go into that a little bit more. And this all goes back to us wanting to make sure that there's no fraud involved. So before I get into this, let me just talk about in-state RON versus out-of-state RON. Ruth talked about this, but Oregon has a really good law in place that, you know, if the law is followed, it's kind of like the cream of the crop in terms of RON laws. And, you know, all title insurance companies are really comfortable that if the law is followed, you know, the chance of having a fraudulent document signed, or a fraudster, you know, signing a document is very minimal. But when you get into other states in the United States that have different RON laws, some of the laws are very weak. You know, for example, like South, I think it's, I have it on another slide, the next slide, but there's a couple of states where the laws really are not very strong, and it all really goes back to the identity proofing. The identity proofing is not strong enough to make title insurance companies comfortable that there's no fraud. And so title insurance companies may accept, you know, an Oregon RON notarization, but they won't accept one from another state like Vermont. I think Vermont's one of those ones where it's really weak. So, you know, just be aware of that. And with a limited number of Oregon notaries right now, more than likely, you know, if you're doing a transaction in the next, you know, few months in particular, you know, you're probably going to be having to use an out-of-state RON notary. So you're going to have to make sure that the title company is comfortable with the state where that notary is licensed. Actually, all title companies, they're going to want multi-factor identification, and this is built into Oregon's law. But in order for us to accept something from out of state, I mean, we really want two things. We want credential analysis. That's where somebody holds their ID up to the screen. And not only are we able to look at that ID and, you know, look at the picture and compare that to the video feed of the person who's holding it up, but we also, there's usually software involved that can, you know, look at that identification and detect whether it's fraudulent or not. And I don't know exactly how that's done, but that is part of the, you know, the credential analysis. A lot of the platforms have that built into it. The other part of this is, and Ruth mentioned this also, is knowledge-based authentication. And so with knowledge-based authentication, if any of you guys have gotten your credit reports online, you know, it's knowledge-based authentication. They ask you a bunch of questions. They say that it's outside of wallet. So if somebody stole your wallet, they should not be able to answer these questions, right? And so it's usually like, okay, 10 years ago, did you live at one of these 4 houses? You know, okay, you know, 15 years ago, did you have a loan with any of these companies? So it's stuff that you, again, if somebody stole your wallet, they're not going to be able to answer the question. And so that's knowledge-based authentication. That is absolutely required by title insurance companies. And to the extent that you're not getting that, like let's say, for example, a state law, and you see a lot of this right now because some states didn't have RON laws, and then, you know, COVID hit, and the governors by emergency orders, you know, have created these various you know, different types of doing remote notarizations. And some of them are these FaceTime notarizations where the only thing that's different is that you're looking at somebody over the screen versus in person. And in terms of, you know, the identity verification, they're just holding up an ID and that's it. That's all there is. That will not be acceptable to any title insurer. I can almost guarantee that. And so just be aware of that. The other part of that is that not all title insurance companies have approved every platform, every notary platform, remote online notary platform out there. You know, there's Notarize, there's Notary Cam, there's Vivasso, there's tons of other ones, but each title insurance company, you know, is going to determine who they're comfortable with. And again, that goes back to doing, you know, due diligence and trying to figure out, you know, their process, how long they keep the videos, you know, do they do the credential analysis and all the other stuff? But the bottom line is just be aware that, you know, your client should not go out there and sign up for, you know, sign up with a platform directly and do, you know, a RON notarization. They need, you know, first without talking to the title insurance company, because, you know, you have to make sure that platform is acceptable to them. If it's not, then they're not going to accept that RON document. And they're going to, you know, chances are that your client's going to have to go and use an authorized platform. So again, not every title insurance company is approved every platform. So, you know, you need to talk to them first. The other thing is that some title insurance companies, you know, will only allow RON documents for residential transactions and not for commercial transactions. First American is one of those where, you know, we only will allow RON for residential transactions up to $2 million. It's not permitted in commercial transactions. And so, again, those are some of the things that, you know, you need to consider. And so, you know, the takeaway from the first, you know, segments I'm talking about right now are that, you know, don't have clients go out on their own and do, you know, do the RON signing. They need to talk to the lender. You know, if they're a buyer, they need to talk to their lender and make sure that it's acceptable. And they need to talk to the title insurance company. And ultimately, in order for RON to take place in a normal purchase and sale transaction where the buyer is getting, you know, a loan, I mean, the bottom line is that everybody, the buyer, the seller, and the buyer's lender is ultimately going to have to sign off and be comfortable with it in addition to the title insurance company. All right, so here's some kind of common problems that I've seen over the last, you know, few months when I've dealt with RON notarizations. And so one is the platforms generally, and I want to say, you know, this is across all platforms, but I don't know that for sure. But in general, what I've heard is that platforms require the person to have a social security number or a taxpayer identification number in order for knowledge-based authentication to work. So if you have somebody that, you know, is a foreigner, okay, and they don't have a taxpayer identification number, but they own U.S. real property, the platforms, it's not going to work. Okay, RON is not going to work. The platforms aren't going to be able to verify that person's identity. Now, if you have a foreign person who, you know, lived in the U.S., maybe they had a work visa and they have a taxpayer identification number, I've heard that that does work. You know, again, if you can't get a U.S. credit report on somebody, you're not going to be able to do knowledge-based authentication. So that is an issue. And so just watch out if you're dealing with a foreign person. Okay. Platform backlog. So you can imagine that when the virus hit, and nowadays people don't want to show up to face-to-face closings, right? So these platforms were inundated, and they're still inundated. And so it's difficult to get new notaries on the platforms. There's, you know, oftentimes months backlog just to get a notary on a platform. But in terms of signing sessions, you know, oftentimes if somebody is just going on there individually, you know, and not through a title insurance company, you know, they could wait weeks or months to actually get an appointment. And so that's the one other advantage that title companies have is that, you know, we generally have contracts with the platforms and we have priority in use. And so we typically want to coordinate all the signing sessions, and we'll tell people, you know, when their signing session is, and you know, we'll make sure we're comfortable with the notary, et cetera. So definitely that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Don't have your clients go on the platforms on their own. Work through the title insurance company. And then this is what I mentioned earlier, is that not all title insurance companies will accept out-of-state RON from certain states. And Vermont and South Dakota are the two that we ban just because you know, their standards are loose. There are other ones as well. I can tell you that generally what states are acceptable to most title insurance companies are, you know, and you'll see tons of notaries from these states because the states I'm about to mention are states where they've had good solid RON laws with, you know, the really good identity proofing. They've been on the books for, you know, a number of years. And so, you know, Texas is one, Florida notaries is one, Virginia notaries, that can go either way because, you know, their state, their identity proofing isn't as great as some of the other states, but a lot of title companies will still accept them if the Virginia notary is on a platform that is going to do those enhanced identity verification anyway. So anyway, the bottom line is that, you know, just coordinate through a title insurance company. You're not gonna have to worry about where the notary comes from because they're only gonna set you up with a notary that's acceptable to them. So that is it for my common problems, and I'm willing to take questions.
Rich, so I want to follow up on that last point you made because you talked about the need for the lender, the buyer, the seller, and the title company to all be on the same page. But you know, want to make this as easy as possible for realtors and their clients in particular. So if the client just comes, you know, the buyer comes straight to the title company and says, hey, I want to do Ron, can you all kind of coordinate the rest from here? Is that okay, or is the buyer going to have to do a lot of work to figure out?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I mean, we don't mind being the conduit. And so, you know, we would do all the stuff that I mentioned behind the scenes. So we would contact the lender and we would ask the lender if, you know, if it's acceptable or not. We go to the lender first because they're usually the ones that says no, frankly. And so we would do that behind the scenes. But if the lender said yes, then we would say, okay, we go to the seller and say, you know, I guess if it's the buyer that is doing the RON signing, and it would only be on the deed of trust. In that case, we probably wouldn't have the seller sign off. But let's say it's a seller that is given the deed, you know, that the buyer has to accept. Well, and that deed of trust is going to be granting the security interest in that property that was conveyed by that, you know, RON deed. And in that case, you know, if it's a seller using RON, we want the lender and the buyer to sign off on it, you know, make sure they're comfortable. But anyway, we would take care of that behind the scenes. Most title companies will do that.
Great, thanks. You know, it sounds like this would be a great thing where we, you know, OAR, we could put together a little advisory that we send out to our members that kind of explains all this and sort of how to talk to our clients about it. So hopefully that's something you'd all be interested in working with me on, and something we could get out. So the number, Ruth, you know, I think it was 25 or so that you showed that are currently Oregon certified for this. Do you have projections about the pace at which that's going to increase and what you expect to see a year from now?
So the number is actually 54 as of June 30th, and it was 25 notaries that are certified for in-person electronic notarization, so different than Ron.
Yeah.
So we don't have any projection because two reasons. You know, one, we don't have any experience in this, and two, Rich talked about the backlog with the platforms, and you know that can't be ignored. So we're making sure that we're working with notaries to make sure that they understand all of the elements that have to be present, that they've chosen the right platform for them, knowing that they can choose more than one platform if they can get enrolled. And then we're just there in a supportive way. But we can't fix the market problem. I mean, the pandemic has created sort of this, for lack of a better term, you know, sort of world of haves and have-nots, you know, the essential workers and the non-essential workers, and the businesses that can continue and the ones that had to shut down. Well, Ron platforms were sort of like, you know, among those essential businesses, and they all kind of exploded during this time because of real concerns about safety for people. And so they're still trying to be measured and thoughtful. And then you have to remember that the business that they're in is still relatively new, even though it has been going on, as Richard mentioned, for a few years in other states. The activity that's happening right now is very, very confusing for the public, very confusing for professionals like me, because as he mentioned, there are states that are doing what they call remote online notarization through executive order or through legislation, but it's not actually what we think of as remote online notarization. So, you know, when Rich mentioned knowledge-based authentication, if you're not using a platform that has knowledge-based authentication, then the notarization that you are engaging in is not legal in Oregon. And I mean, you know, it would be subject to challenge, and nobody wants a high value transaction, or frankly, any notarization, to be subject to challenge, because then you're getting into a court situation. And I honestly expect that will happen for some of those states that have adopted this sort of loose, you know, we're going to do this during the pandemic, and then we're not going to do it after this, but we're going to do FaceTime and Zoom and Google Meet. And, you know, that's going to be and you're going to hold up your driver's license, and that's going to be the way that the notary identifies you. I think we're going to probably see, especially if there's asset transfers involved in those kinds of notarizations, or there's high value, we'll see a lot of court challenges, I think, and we'll probably see some some rulings come out of that shape the industry for years to come. So Oregon has taken really a very conservative approach to make sure that citizens are protected the best way we know how. And that knowledge-based authentication is a really critical factor for that.
Yeah, I just want to add that that the platform backlog, just one thing, this is what Ruth talked about earlier, just not most recently, but the platform backlog is probably going to go on for a number of months again. So that's really going to be a bottleneck. If you looked at Ruth's presentation, remember that where they had the order or what's required in order to get licensed as an Oregon RON, and one of those is you have to have your exemplar of what your notarization is going to look like, your electronic notarization. You have to get that from the platform, and you don't get that until you finally go through their whole process. So that's really the biggest backlog, and that's why I think that you know, you're not going to see those numbers go up dramatically for months. Really, that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I might add one little clarifying piece to that to explain kind of parts of the reasons why platforms are have these huge backlogs. I talked to the general counsel from notarize.com, who was very involved in crafting both the legislation that we're talking about today, and then also legislation that's meant for consideration in the 2021 session for permanent adoption of RON. And she said that they spend 2 to 3 weeks training every single notary that comes to work for them, because they, at least last time I talked to them, were on an employment model. So in their case, they would hire a notary who was interested and qualified and came from a state where this was legal. But one of the things they were finding is that those states' training methodologies, or that maybe the notary's ability to receive the information, was such that the notary didn't even understand all of the types of transactions that they may encounter while working on the platform. And the platforms, just like title companies, lenders, buyers and sellers and realtors, have a huge element of risk that they are trying to manage through this process. And so that 2 to 3 week training, if a notary can't successfully get through that, then they're not going to bring that notary on board. And so that's why I made that note that, well, we have this very small number of RON notaries right now that are commissioned in Oregon. We're not going to push notaries to do this at all, because we really want them to be able to sail through that 2 or 3 week training, depending on what the platform requires, because we don't want the notary to have additional risk associated with this unless they can handle it, right? We want them to be able to handle it. And so this is where we start to talk to notaries about, you know, do you need to get errors and omissions insurance? Do you need to buy on your own a performance bond or a surety bond, so that there's some way for a consumer who has a concern with you to seek redress, right? Other than just in the courts. So we want notaries to be at that level of sophistication before they engage in this kind of transaction.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And I think we did have one question in the chat box, but I think you guys hit on it. It was related to the backlog. But they did ask, so how long? I mean, if a notary was to try to get on board right now, what would be the turnaround time, do you think?
I don't know. And I think it depends on the platform largely. And again, not every platform takes all comers, you know. So Rich mentioned that First American has a contractual arrangement with one or more platforms, and so they get priority use of that platform. If you have a notary who is in individual practice, they're not an employee of First American or some other concern that has a contractual relationship with one or more platforms, then it may take them quite a bit longer, because frankly, the risk is mitigated much more easily when it comes to those larger concerns that have, you know, hundreds or maybe even thousands of notaries in their system that are going to be doing RON notarizations. So from a platform kind of risk management perspective, it makes a lot of sense that it would be faster to do it that way and a lot slower to do it notary by notary by notary. But I think we will get to the point. I think Rich nailed it when he said it's going to be several months at least. And I would guess that it's going to be a year before we start to see easy kind of scaled up ways for notaries to enroll with platforms at the speed that they would like. But I think we're probably still going to see that need for that 2 to 3 week training, depending on what the platform's requirements are.
Great. Thanks. Well, I think we're out of time, but I just want to take a moment to thank all of you, both for being here today and talking us through this new thing, and that we're all learning as we go, but also for all of your leadership and helping to get this program going. Now, all of you are involved heavily in working on legislation and prioritizing it and sort of elevating it during the pandemic so that Oregon could get going on this and catch up with other states. And we were glad to work with you on that and really appreciate your leadership there. And so we'll send around slides. We'll work together on some documents that we can put out for our members to help them better understand this and how to talk to their clients about it. And thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.